Have you ever sat in silence only to realize your mind wasn't silent at all? A single word someone said, a sideways glance, a message left on read, and suddenly your chest tightens. Your thoughts start racing. Your peace dissolves like mist in the morning sun. But pause. Did that person really cause your suffering? Or did your own mind do it for them? Most of us grow up believing pain comes from the outside. He broke my heart. She made me feel small. They didn't appreciate me. The world is unfair. But here's the truth. Suffering doesn't begin out there. It begins in here. Quietly, invisibly, inside your own mind. It's not the breakup that ruins you. It's the story you keep repeating afterward. I wasn't enough. I'll always be alone. It's not the criticism that hurts most. It's the echo in your head that says, they're right, I'm worthless. You see events happen, people come and go, but you're suffering. That's a story your mind continues to tell long after the moment is gone. Thousands of years ago, the Buddha sat under a tree and made a radical discovery. He saw that pain is part of life. Yes, but suffering, the torment, the emotional spirals, the endless craving and clinging, that's optional, that's created. Created by what? By thought, by attachment, by the mind's refusal to accept what is. Imagine this. Two people lose their jobs on the same day. One sits at home thinking, I'm a failure. No one wants me. The other says, well, something new is waiting. Let's see what I can learn. Same event, different suffering, because pain is real. But suffering, that's personal, that's internal, and it always begins with a single seed, a thought. But here's the thing no one teaches you in school. You are not your thoughts. You are the one watching them. Most people go through life being bullied by their own minds. They don't even realize it. A thought arises and they believe it. An emotion swells and they follow it. A fear appears and they obey it. They never ask, is this true? Is this helpful? Is this mine or just something I learned? The Buddha called this ignorance, avidya, the root of all suffering. Not ignorance as stupidity, but as forgetting. Forgetting who you really are beneath all those thoughts. The truth is simple, but powerful. No one can make you suffer unless you give them the keys to your mind. You suffer not because of what they said, but because of what you keep thinking about what they said. You suffer not because life is hard, but because you resist the way life moves. The pain is not in the event. The pain is in the attachment. Now, you might be wondering, if suffering is created in the mind, does that mean I can be free? Yes, but not by fighting your thoughts, not by controlling the world. Freedom comes by seeing clearly. When you understand the mind, you're no longer enslaved by it. When you become aware of your thoughts, they lose their grip. When you let go of needing things to go your way, peace arrives, not as a prize, but as a natural state. There's a story of a Zen master whose house was burned down by bandits. His students expected him to cry, to rage, to despair. Instead, he simply said, "Now the moonlight can reach my bed." Loss didn't make him suffer. Why? Because he saw it as it was, just loss, not betrayal, not tragedy, just change. He didn't decorate it with painful thoughts. He didn't cling to how things should have been. He let reality be real. And that's why he was free. In a world that constantly pulls your attention outward, to news, to noise, to likes and dislikes, the greatest rebellion is turning inward. Not to escape, but to understand. Your mind is not your enemy, but if left unchecked, it becomes a tyrant. It spins stories of lack, of fear, of judgment. And it tells you they are truth. They're not. They're clouds passing through an open sky. And you are the sky. So here's the invitation. Don't fight your pain, watch it. Don't judge your thoughts, see them. Don't fear your suffering, understand it. Because the moment you stop blaming the world and start watching your mind, that's the moment freedom begins. Not someday, not when everything's perfect, but now, right now. And when you begin to see where your suffering truly starts, you'll be ready to see how it silently grows. Sometimes it's not just one thought. It's the echo chamber, the mental prison you didn't even know you built. That's what we'll uncover next, because once you see the bars, you'll know how to walk free. You don't need walls to be in a prison. Sometimes all it takes is a thought. A single, unquestioned belief repeated enough times can chain your spirit tighter than any set of bars. And the strangest part is, you won't even realize you're trapped. You'll wake up, drink your coffee, check your phone, go to work, all while living inside a story your mind has told you for years. I'm not good enough. People always leave me. No one really understands me. If I fail, I'm nothing. If they don't like me, I must be worthless. These aren't just thoughts, they're invisible walls. And day by day, they shrink your world, one mental brick at a time, until what was once a life full of possibilities becomes a loop of overthinking, self-doubt, and fear. There's a Buddhist parable about a man shot by a poisoned arrow. Instead of pulling it out, he insists on asking, who shot it? What kind of bow did they use? What tribe are they from? By the time he finishes his questions, he's already dying. That's what our minds do. Instead of feeling what's real, we analyze, replay, and obsess. We try to solve emotions like math problems. We demand explanations for pain. But healing doesn't happen in the thinking. It happens in the seeing. Look around. How many of your thoughts today were recycled from yesterday? How many of them were true? And how many were just noise? Automatic, habitual, unexamined. The mind loves patterns. It tells the same stories on repeat, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this time it will feel different. But it doesn't, because suffering doesn't end by thinking more. It ends by seeing the thinking for what it is. Here's the trap. We believe our thoughts are facts, but thoughts are not facts. They're just weather. They come, they go, some loud, some quiet, some stormy, some still. But they are never you. A woman once came to the Buddha in tears. Her husband had left her. Her family shunned her. She said, I am worthless. No one wants me. The Buddha looked at her and asked, when you walk through a muddy field, does the mud make you dirty forever? She shook her head. He smiled gently and said, then why believe that temporary pain means you are broken? That's the power of insight, of seeing thought for what it is, a passing ripple in a much deeper ocean. But most people never stop long enough to look. They distract, they scroll, they drink, they run, because silence is scary when your mind is screaming. But what if the silence isn't empty? What if it's where the real healing begins? Try this. Next time a painful thought arises, don't run. Don't fight, just watch it. Watch it like a cloud drifting across the sky. Notice how it moves, how it fades, how it changes. Ask yourself, did I choose this thought, or did it just appear? Does this thought help me suffer less or more? You'll be amazed at what you find. Most of your suffering wasn't created by the event. It was created by the commentary that followed. A breakup hurts, but the endless story of not being lovable, that's the prison. Losing a job stings, but the spiral of shame, the fear of judgment, the narrative of failure, that's the prison. Even something small, a text left unanswered, can spark hours of imaginary arguments, overanalyzing, anxiety. The other person might have just been busy, but your mind turned it into a trial. So how do we break free? First, stop believing every thought you think. Just because it shows up in your head doesn't mean it deserves a seat at your table. Second, practice noticing the loop. Awareness interrupts the pattern. The moment you can say, I've thought this before, you're already stepping outside the prison. And third, be kind to yourself. The mind isn't evil. It learned to protect you. It built stories to make sense of pain. But what protected you once may now be the very thing holding you back. There's a saying in Zen, The bird is safe in its cage, but it was meant to fly. Your mind built a cage, not because it hates you, but because it feared the world. But you are not here to live in fear. You are here to wake up, to remember you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness that sees them, and when you begin to see the cage, you don't have to fight it, you just stop feeding it. And that's when something miraculous happens. The door opens, not because the world changed, but because you did. Because you stopped trying to control every thought and started watching them instead. Because you stopped living in your head and started arriving in your life. And when you finally step out of that prison, you'll start to notice something even deeper, that underneath all the noise, all the clinging, all the desperate searching, was something soft, still quiet, a part of you untouched by thought, and that part knows peace. We'll meet that part soon, but first we must meet the root of suffering itself. The one illusion so powerful, it keeps us trapped our whole lives. There's a voice in your head. It says things like, I deserve better. How could they do that to me? I'm not enough. I'm the best. Sometimes proud, sometimes ashamed, sometimes angry, sometimes anxious, but always circling one center, I. The I that wants, the I that fears, the I that must be right, the I that must be seen. But what if this I isn't what you think it is? The Buddha once said, in all the 84,000 teachings I have taught one thing. There is no self, not because you don't exist, but because the self you think you are, the one you defend, promote, compare, and protect, is a story, a moving target, a shapeshifter. Built from childhood wounds, social expectations, compliments, and criticisms. A patchwork of memories and labels. Think about it. When you were 5, you believed you were someone. At 15, you believed you were someone else. At 25, another version. At 35, it changes again. Which one is the real you? Which voice in your head should you trust? The one that says you're amazing or the one that says you're unworthy? Maybe neither. Maybe the voice itself is the illusion. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The ego wants to suffer because suffering confirms its existence. I was hurt, therefore I am. I was betrayed, so I must protect myself. I was overlooked, so I must prove something. It feeds on drama. It feeds on conflict. It feeds on identity. Even being the victim becomes an identity. A man once came to a Zen master furious. He shouted, "They disrespected me. They embarrassed me in front of everyone." The master calmly asked, "Who is this me that was disrespected?" The man blinked, confused. "Me, I'm talking about me." The master smiled. "If you can find this me and bring it here, I will make sure it never gets hurt again." The man left in silence. We don't realize how often we suffer because we're busy defending a phantom. You don't suffer because someone spoke harshly. You suffer because your image of yourself felt attacked. You don't suffer because you failed. You suffer because your identity as someone who must succeed got shaken. The pain isn't in the moment. It's in the meaning the ego gives to the moment. And here's the trickiest part. The ego isn't always loud. Sometimes it disguises itself as spirituality, as kindness, as morality. I'm a good person. I shouldn't be treated this way. I'm awakened. They're still unconscious. I'm not attached to ego, unlike them. It's still the same voice, just wearing different robes. So what happens when you stop feeding it? When you stop needing to be someone? When you stop clinging to roles, titles, masks? What's left is space, stillness, a deeper kind of awareness that doesn't rise and fall with praise or blame. Not numb, not passive, just free. In Buddhism, this is called anatta, the doctrine of non-self. Not that you don't exist, but that you don't exist the way you think. You're not a fixed shape. You're not your thoughts. You're not your emotions. You're not even your story. You're the space in which all of it arises. You are awareness itself. And awareness doesn't suffer. When someone insults you, awareness doesn't flinch. When you lose something, awareness doesn't panic. When praise comes, awareness doesn't puff up. Only the ego reacts. Only the I wants to hold on. But here's the paradox. The tighter you cling to being someone, the more life will feel like an attack. Because life doesn't care who you think you are. It just moves. And if you resist it, you suffer. There's a Sufi saying, the truth is like a lion. It doesn't need defending. Let it loose. It will defend itself. You don't need to defend your ego. You don't need to prove your worth. You don't need to control every narrative. You can let go. And in that letting go, you don't become less. You become real, not the constructed self, but the spacious, luminous being that watches it all unfold. So next time the voice in your head rises up, telling you what you should be, what you must protect, how you were wronged, just pause. Ask yourself, who is this I that's hurting? Is this voice helping, or just repeating an old pattern? And then watch. Watch how quickly it disappears when you stop feeding it. Watch how peace returns. Not because the world changed, but because you no longer believe the character in the story. And when that illusion dissolves, you begin to notice something else rising in its place. Something softer, wiser, infinitely more peaceful. But we'll get to that. First, let's walk through the fire, because nothing exposes the ego more clearly than heartbreak, betrayal, and loss. And nothing cracks the illusion faster than watching the stories break apart. The next step isn't always quiet, but it is powerful. Let's keep walking. She sat across from me, eyes hollow, voice shaking. I can't sleep. I can't eat. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face. He had left her. 10 years together, then gone. No warning, no closure, just silence. But the pain wasn't just about him. It was about everything she thought their future would be. The life they planned, the story in her head, the identity she had built. And now it was all ash. Do you miss him? I asked. She paused. No, not really. What I miss is who I was when I was with him. I miss believing I was loved. That's when it hit her. She wasn't grieving the man. She was grieving the meaning she had created. And that meaning lived entirely in her mind. We tend to think pain is about what happened, but real suffering, it's not about what happened. It's about the stories we attach to what happened. I wasn't enough. I'll never find love again. Everyone leaves me. These are not facts. They're beliefs, conditioned thoughts that replay like broken records, until one day we mistake the noise for truth. Another story. He was a successful executive, smart, respected, in control. Until one morning he got the call. His son gone, car crash, instant. The world stopped, and so did he. He tried to be strong, kept working, said all the right things, but inside he was drowning. What destroyed him wasn't just the loss, it was the guilt. If only I had called that night. Why didn't I tell him I loved him more? I should have been a better father. Again, grief is real. But the endless cycle of self-blame, regret, and imagined control. That's the mind, creating suffering on top of suffering. The turning point came months later. He sat in meditation, breath shallow, eyes closed, and suddenly something shifted. Not a grand spiritual moment, just a whisper inside. What if this pain doesn't need to mean I failed? And in that moment, he stopped fighting the grief and started feeling it, not analyzing, not fixing, just letting it be. And that was the first time he cried, not the hard, angry tears, but soft, human tears of surrender. We're so quick to judge pain, to label it, to intellectualize it, to make it mean something. But sometimes healing doesn't come from answers, it comes from presence, from sitting with what hurts, without turning it into a lifelong identity. Have you ever noticed that the moment you stop resisting pain, it changes, not disappears, but softens? Pain wants your attention, not your punishment. It wants to be seen, not solved. Held, not hidden. It's not trying to destroy you. It's trying to wake you up. One more story. She was in her 60s. Her son hadn't spoken to her in years. Every birthday, every holiday, she'd sit by the phone, hoping, waiting, and every year it never rang. She carried this like a stone in her heart. I must have been a bad mother. That's why he left. Until one day, after a mindfulness class, she shared something that silenced the whole room. I realized I've been parenting a ghost, not him, but the version of him I imagined. And I've been punishing myself for a story I never truly understood. She didn't get her son back, but she got something else: freedom. Freedom from self-blame, freedom from the loop, freedom from believing that pain had to equal punishment. These stories are real. The pain, real. The heartbreak, real. The wounds, deep. But what makes them unbearable is the mental cage we build around them. The should've and could've and what-ifs. The comparison, the shame, the imagined audience judging our every move. But inside every story of suffering, there's a hidden doorway. A moment when the person doesn't escape their pain, but steps through it. And on the other side is not perfection, not answers, but clarity, a softness, a surrender, a silence that doesn't beg for noise. And if you listen closely, you'll hear it in your own life. The moment you realize the anger wasn't helping, the day you stopped blaming and just breathed, the night you stopped talking to the world and started listening to your own heart. That's the beginning, that's the shift. The stories don't disappear, but they lose their grip, and in their place something ancient stirs. The wisdom to be with what is. So the next time your pain feels unbearable, ask yourself, what story am I believing right now? Is it true? Is it helpful? Is it kind? And what if I didn't need to believe it at all? Sometimes the most healing thing you can do is not to fix your pain, but to hold it gently, without needing to become it. And in that holding, you begin to remember you are not what happened to you. You are not your broken moments. You are not your pain. You are the awareness that holds them all. Like the sky holds every storm, without ever being damaged by the rain. But awareness alone isn't enough. To truly be free, we must learn to see the mind as it moves, to catch it in the act of spiraling, to interrupt the loop. And that, my friend, begins with presence, with mindfulness. We're not done yet. We're just beginning to break the cycle. It begins with a single breath. That's all, just one breath, not heroic, not dramatic, just the quiet decision to pause instead of react. And in that pause, something powerful awakens. Not a god, not a guru, but a simple, sacred awareness that whispers, you are here, and that is enough. Mindfulness is not an escape. It's not pretending pain isn't real. It's not sitting cross-legged trying to levitate above your suffering. Mindfulness is the opposite. It's the art of turning toward your experience, without judgment, without resistance, without needing to be anywhere else. Most people live like this. An emotion arises, right arrow, thought reacts, right arrow, the body tenses, right arrow, we act on autopilot. Over and over again. Someone criticizes us, right arrow, we feel threatened, right arrow, we lash out. A memory surfaces, right arrow, we get sad, right arrow, we isolate. Anxiety comes, right arrow, we overthink, right arrow, we spiral. This cycle doesn't stop because the world changes. It stops when you stop feeding it. And mindfulness, that's the moment you step off the treadmill. Here, that's how the mind usually works. You feel anger. Instead of noticing it, you become it. You identify with it, you act from it, but mindfulness says, this is anger arising in me, I see it, I feel it. But it is not me. That tiny gap between feeling and reaction. That's where freedom lives. Think about it. Have you ever noticed how your thoughts behave when you're unaware? They race, they argue, They pull you into imagined futures and painful pasts. They speak in absolutes. This will never get better. I always mess things up. They don't respect me. But when you bring attention, gentle, curious attention, the storm begins to settle. Why? Because the mind, when watched, loses its control. In Buddhism, we don't try to kill the ego, we understand it. We watch how it forms stories, attachments, identities. We learn to see, this is a thought, not the truth. And slowly, what once controlled us becomes something we can simply observe. Here's the key. Mindfulness isn't about controlling the mind. It's about befriending it. It's sitting with anxiety like an old friend, watching sadness like you watch rain fall on a window, without trying to stop it, without running away. When you do that, something amazing happens. Emotions still come, but they don't stay as long. They don't take the wheel. They move through you instead of defining you. A monk once said, "You can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf." Mindfulness is that surfboard. It doesn't remove the chaos. It teaches you to ride it with grace. Let's be real. You will still feel pain. You will still get angry, sad, overwhelmed. But the difference is now. You'll know it's not permanent. It's not personal. It's not who you are. It's just a passing cloud. In the vast sky of your awareness, imagine this: you're stuck in traffic. You're late. Your chest tightens. The voice in your head starts yelling, "I'm such an idiot for taking this route. Why is this city always a mess? I can't believe this is happening again." But now, imagine this moment again. With mindfulness, you notice the tension in your chest. You feel your grip on the steering wheel. You hear the thoughts, but you don't get pulled in. You take a breath, and just like that, you create space. Not traffic-free space, but mental space, spiritual space. The kind that says, yes, this is frustrating, but I can meet it with calm. That's not weakness, that's mastery. And what's wild? This isn't something only monks can do. You don't need a mountain cave. You need just one thing: willingness to look inside, to watch, to listen, to feel fully without running. That's the real meditation. Not posture, not mantras, but the courage to stay awake in the middle of your life. The Buddha didn't promise a life without pain. He offered something deeper, a path to end suffering. Not by changing the world, but by changing the way we relate to it. And that begins with presence. So the next time your mind spirals, pause, breathe. Notice what's happening without naming it as good or bad. Ask yourself, what is really happening here? What am I believing? Can I hold this moment with kindness? And just like that, you've broken the chain. The cycle has been interrupted. The storm for now has passed, and in its place is silence, spaciousness, freedom. But mindfulness is just the beginning. To truly walk this path, we must also understand the root of craving, the constant wanting, grasping, reaching, that endless hunger that says, when I get this, then I'll be happy. But what if that's the trap? What if craving is not our savior, but the very architect of our suffering? Let's go deeper. At some point, we all carry too much, too many expectations, too many regrets, too many versions of who we think we should be, and yet we wonder why we feel so heavy. There's a voice inside that whispers, if I let this go, I'll lose everything. I'll be weak. I'll fall behind. But what if the opposite is true? What if letting go isn't the end of something, but the beginning of freedom? Let's go back. Why do we hold on? To control, to protect, to feel safe in a world that constantly shifts. We cling to relationships that no longer nourish us. We grip tightly to identities that no longer reflect us. We grasp at past wounds, thinking they somehow define us. But here's the truth. Nothing in this world was ever meant to be held forever. Not your pain, not your victories, not even your self-image. Everything is passing. Like clouds drifting across the sky, the tighter we grip, the more we suffer. Imagine standing in a river. You see a log floating downstream. You reach out and grab it. You hold it thinking it will keep you safe, but the river keeps moving. And now you're not grounded. You're being dragged by the very thing you thought would protect you. That's what attachment does. It starts as comfort and becomes a current that pulls you away from peace. In Buddhism, this is called upadana, clinging. It's not love that causes suffering. It's the grasping behind the love, the need for things to stay the same, the belief that I must have this to be whole. But everything changes, and the more we demand permanence from what is impermanent, the more we break our own hearts. Here's the paradox: the more we let go, the more we return to ourselves. You don't lose anything real by letting go. You only lose the illusion of control. You lose the stories that never served you. You lose the weight you were never meant to carry. And in return, you gain spaciousness, clarity, a kind of inner lightness that no possession, no title, no praise can give you. Think about the most peaceful people you've ever met. Were they full of things, or were they full of space? It's the ones who have released the need to be right, the need to impress, the need to win. Those are the ones who move through the world with grace. They've discovered that peace isn't something you chase. It's what's left when you stop chasing. But don't misunderstand. Letting go isn't passive. It's not giving up or becoming numb. It's an act of immense courage to face your fear, to feel your pain, to say, this no longer serves my growth. I release it. That takes strength. That's not defeat. That's liberation. A Zen master once said, let go or be dragged. Those 5 words have rescued countless souls because life will keep moving, whether you flow with it or resist it. Suffering comes not from what happens, but from your refusal to accept that it has happened. Letting go means allowing life to be life, allowing people to be people, allowing yourself to evolve without needing permission. It means saying goodbye, not with bitterness, but with compassion, to memories, to identities, to expectations, not because they weren't meaningful, but because they have finished their part in your journey. There's a story of a man who carries a heavy bag of rocks. He doesn't know why, but he never questions it. One day, someone asks, "What's in the bag?" He opens it and realizes it's just weight, no purpose. He sets it down, and for the first time in years, he can breathe, he can move freely, he can see the path ahead. We all carry bags like that, and we forget we are allowed to set them down. Letting go is an invitation to return to the present, to trust that you don't need to control everything to be okay, to understand that freedom doesn't come from holding on tighter, but from releasing gently. So ask yourself, what are you holding that no longer holds you? What story do you keep repeating even though it hurts? What would happen if you just breathed and let it go? Would you fall apart, or would you finally feel whole? The Buddha didn't teach detachment as coldness. He taught it as wisdom. Letting go doesn't mean not caring. It means caring deeply without clinging, loving fully without owning, living presently without needing every moment to go your way. And here's the beautiful secret. When you let go, you make room for what's true, not more, just real. You stop living for the next moment and start living this one, fully, unapologetically, light as air. And yet, even when we begin to let go, there's one thing that always tries to pull us back. The stories we've told ourselves 1,000 times. The inner narratives that say, I am not enough, I am broken, I am unworthy of peace. In the next chapter, we'll meet those stories head-on and learn how to rewrite them with the gentle ink of truth. There is a voice in your head. You hear it right now. It speaks in your own language, in your own tone. And you've listened to it for so long. You've come to believe it is you. But here's the truth. You are not your thoughts. You never were. Your thoughts say, I'm a failure, I'll never be enough, they don't respect me, and so you feel small, anxious, stuck. But where did those thoughts come from? Were you born with them? Did they arise from truth, or were they borrowed from fear? The Buddha taught, all that we are is the result of what we have thought. The mind is everything. But he didn't mean your thoughts define you. He meant that when you attach to them, believe in them blindly, you create your world through them. If your thoughts are cloudy, your life becomes a storm. But when you recognize your thoughts as just thoughts, temporary, fleeting, not inherently you become free. Let's break it down. A thought arises, I'm not good enough. You don't question it, you accept it like a verdict, and then you shrink, you cancel plans, you avoid challenges. You live small because one unexamined thought told you to. This is the trap, not the world, not your past, but your belief that your thoughts are facts. Imagine sitting by a river. Leaves float on the surface. Each leaf is a thought, some beautiful, some ugly, some terrifying. You can reach in and grab them, clutch them, or you can watch them drift by. Mindfulness teaches us this exact art, awareness without attachment, to see the thought, but not become it. Non-attachment is not indifference. It's not apathy or avoidance. It's clarity, it's realizing. This thought is passing through me, but it does not own me. And here's the powerful part. Most of your thoughts aren't even yours. They are echoes of what parents said, what society expects, what trauma taught you to believe. You inherited them. You rehearsed them. You wore them like armor. But that armor became a cage. And today, you have the key. Ask yourself, who am I if I no longer believe every voice in my head? What happens if I watch a thought rise and let it pass? Like a cloud, like a breeze, like a bird flying overhead. There's a reason ancient monks spent decades training their minds, not to get rid of thoughts, but to stop believing in everyone, to make space, to return to silence, to see clearly what's real and what's just noise. And make no mistake, the mind is clever. It will disguise judgment as truth. It will dress fear in logic. It will whisper, this is just being realistic. But realistic often means limited by old pain. True wisdom is knowing not every thought deserves your trust. You are the witness, the awareness behind the thought. Like the sky behind the weather, storms will come, lightning will strike, but the sky remains untouched, still, vast, infinite. That is who you are. When you realize this, a shift begins. You stop reacting, you start responding. You pause, breathe, observe, and in that pause, you reclaim your power. A thought says, I can't do this, and you smile because now you know. That's just a thought, not a prophecy, not a life sentence, just a passing cloud. And just like that, you don't shrink, you rise. This is the wisdom of non-attachment, not running from thought, not fighting thought, but watching it gently. Like a parent watching a child throw a tantrum, kindly, patiently, with a quiet smile that says, this too shall pass. And the more you practice, the more spacious your inner world becomes. No longer a prison of judgment and noise, but a sanctuary of calm observation. You're no longer lost in your mind. You are holding it in awareness, and from that place, something remarkable happens. Compassion arises, not just for others, but for yourself. You begin to forgive the parts of you that believed every dark thought. You begin to soften, and softness is not weakness. It is the doorway to peace. Thoughts will still come, but they won't control you. They'll come like wind, but your roots will be deep. Now imagine what happens when you carry this awareness into every corner of life. Relationships, work, pain, joy. What kind of freedom might you feel if you no longer took everything your mind said personally? You've spent your whole life inside your own mind, but how often have you treated it with kindness? We care for our bodies, we rest, we feed, we stretch. We care for others, we listen, we forgive, we show love. But our minds, we criticize, we pressure, we demand, and when it suffers, we blame it. As if it's broken, as if it should be better by now. But what if your mind has just been doing its best to protect you? Imagine this. A child stands alone in the dark, scared, confused, unsure where to go. Would you yell at that child, call them weak, tell them to just get over it? Of course not. You'd hold them, you'd whisper, "It's okay, I'm here." That's what your mind has needed. Not more judgment, but deep, gentle compassion. Because behind every anxious thought, every overreaction, every self-sabotaging habit is a wounded part of you, just trying to stay safe. It learned to worry because it was once unsafe. It learned to overthink because it was once ignored. It learned to control because it once felt helpless. And instead of punishing your mind for how it's tried to survive, can you thank it? Can you say, "I see you. I know you tried, but we don't need those defenses anymore." Healing doesn't begin with fixing. It begins with seeing, with sitting quietly beside your own mind and saying, "I'm listening now." No pushing, no resisting. Just presence. That's awareness. Awareness is not cold observation. It's love without interference. It's the gentle light that says, you no longer have to hide. And in that light, the mind begins to soften, to loosen its grip, to breathe again. In Buddhism, this is called metta, loving kindness. But it's not just something you give to others. It's something your inner world has been starving for. Your anxious thoughts, meet them with kindness. Your judgmental inner critic, listen to its fear. Don't obey it, but don't shame it either. Your moments of darkness, hold space for them, because every dark corner of your mind is just waiting to be welcomed into the light. And no, it doesn't mean every thought becomes positive. It doesn't mean you stop feeling pain. It means you stop being afraid of what's inside you. You begin to trust the process, to hold yourself with tenderness. Even in the mess, especially in the mess, a lotus blooms from the mud. Not despite it, but because of it. And your healing is the same. It's not about becoming someone different. It's about embracing every part of you that you once ran from, with awareness and with love. So the next time your mind spirals, don't rush to fix it. Don't drown it in distractions or guilt. Pause, breathe, place your hand over your heart and whisper, "I'm here with you." You may be surprised how quickly your mind starts to settle when it knows it's no longer alone. Because when you bring compassion into your awareness, you don't just see your thoughts, you see the suffering beneath them. And when you see suffering clearly, you no longer contribute to it. You no longer believe the fear. You no longer fight the pain. You simply sit beside it, like a friend who doesn't try to fix you, but just says, "I see your pain, and I will not turn away." This is not weakness. This is the strongest kind of love, the love that meets the storm, without running, without judging, without pretending it's not there. And little by little, the storm calms, the inner walls begin to fall, and underneath all the mental noise, you discover a silence that's not empty, but sacred, a silence that says, "You are enough. You are not broken, you are healing." So now your path changes. You no longer walk it by force or fear. You walk it hand in hand with your own awareness, with a gentle voice inside that whispers, "Whatever arises, I'll meet it with compassion." And this is the ground on which true freedom grows. Not the escape from your mind, but the deep, loving return to it. Just as it is, from here, your next step becomes clear, because when compassion anchors awareness, your life no longer spins in reaction. You begin to choose with clarity. You begin to live with depth, and soon, you'll see that compassion is not just for your suffering. It's the bridge to joy, a joy not built on circumstances, but rooted in presence. And in that presence, something deeper begins to stir. But that awakening, we'll walk toward it. In the next chapter, there's a moment when the mind, after being met with compassion, begins to grow still, not because the world has changed, but because you have. You no longer fear your thoughts. You no longer wrestle with your emotions. You sit with them, breathe with them, and see through them. And in that stillness, a new strength awakens, not the kind that roars, not the kind that conquers, but the kind that doesn't flinch, even when the storm returns. This is the strength of the peaceful warrior, not a fighter of the world, but a master of the inner battlefield. Because let's be honest, your greatest opponent has never been outside of you, not the critics, not the chaos, not even the losses. It has always been your own reactive mind, that split-second urge to lash out, to shrink back, to spiral down. But what if you could train your mind the same way warriors train their bodies, with discipline, with awareness, with love? In Buddhism, this training is called bhavana, mental cultivation. It's not about suppressing your thoughts. It's about reshaping your relationship with them. Like a warrior who sharpens their sword, you sharpen your attention. You learn to pause before you react, to choose peace instead of panic, to act from stillness, not from fear. This doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with a single intention. I will not abandon myself in moments of difficulty. When anxiety rises, you breathe. When anger flares, you observe. When sorrow surfaces, you stay. You do not run. You do not numb. You remain present. And that alone is the most powerful act of inner strength. Remember, mastery isn't never falling. It's rising faster, with more grace, with less drama. A peaceful warrior doesn't pretend to feel nothing. They simply don't become the feeling. They let it move through like wind through an open field, felt but not clung to. And here's the secret. The more you train the mind in stillness, the less the world can shake you. Not because the noise has disappeared, but because you've stopped giving it your power. You don't chase validation. You don't run from discomfort. You don't fear the unknown. You watch it all, with calm, with clarity, with compassion. It's like sitting by a river. The thoughts come, the emotions swirl, but you no longer jump in after them. You sit on the bank, you watch, you smile. You know, this too will pass. This is not detachment, it's wisdom. It's knowing that reacting doesn't serve you. That peace doesn't mean avoiding life. It means entering it fully, without being owned by it. There's a moment in every day when something tries to pull you out of presence, an insult, a regret, a craving. You feel it, but instead of flinching, you stand tall inside yourself. You return to the breath, to the body, to awareness, and you whisper inwardly, I am not this storm, I am the sky. Think of the monks who smile in silence, even as the world burns loud around them. They did not escape life. They trained their minds within life, moment by moment, breath by breath. And you are no different. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be consistent. Each time you come back to stillness, you're building inner muscle. Each time you notice the trigger, but don't feed it. You are rewiring your brain, creating space, choosing freedom, and one day, you'll walk through chaos, and nothing will touch you. Not because you've built walls, but because you've dissolved the hooks. There's nothing for the world to grab onto. You're clear, rooted, steady. You've become the peaceful warrior. So when life gets loud again, and it will, don't seek escape. Seek the training ground. Each challenge is a lesson, each emotion a mirror, each breath a weapon of peace. And with time, you'll see that your greatest power was never in controlling the world. It was in mastering the mind that meets it. That's the quiet revolution. That's how you live, unshaken. And when that inner stillness becomes your home, something else begins to stir beneath it. Not just strength, but a deeper kind of joy. A joy untouched by success, failure, gain, or loss. A joy that says, I am free not because the world is quiet, but because my mind is. And in that joy, you begin to walk differently, live differently, love differently. It's a quiet realization, but once it lands, it changes everything. No one makes you suffer, not really, not your past, not your circumstances, not even the people who hurt you. The root of suffering is how your mind responds. It's the interpretation, the resistance, the stories you replay again and again, as if pain were something you needed to protect. But it never was. Pain happens, but suffering is optional, and that is where your power begins. You see, if the world were the cause, you'd be its prisoner forever. But if the mind is the source, you are the key. It doesn't mean others didn't hurt you. It doesn't mean life wasn't unfair, but it does mean you don't have to carry it anymore. You can lay it down, right here, right now, and begin again. The Buddha never promised a life without pain, but he offered a path that ends suffering, not by fixing the world, but by transforming how we meet it. Through mindfulness, you start to see that every reaction is a choice, every thought is a visitor, every emotion is a wave, and you are the ocean. You don't have to follow every story your mind tells. You don't have to obey every fear. You can just watch and let it pass. This is the power of awareness, the power of inner freedom, when you stop saying, "They made me feel this way," and start asking, "Why did I react this way?" Everything changes. You shift from being a victim of life to a student of life, from fighting your experience to flowing with it, from clinging to identity to resting in silence. Suffering ends, not when the world becomes easy, but when the self that resists the world begins to dissolve. That I that clings, that I that fights, that I that fears, you see it now. Not as you, but as a thought, a passing form, not the truth. And from that stillness, a deeper joy arises, not a happiness that depends on how life goes, but a joy that remains, even when nothing goes right. Because it doesn't come from life, it comes from freedom, the freedom to be here, with all of it, without grasping, without pushing, without needing anything to change, just this, just now, just peace. That's the quiet power hidden in your suffering. It points you back to yourself, not the false self that reacts, but the true self that witnesses all, silently, lovingly, unshaken. And when you live from that place, you don't just escape suffering. You become a refuge for others too, like the still mountain in the midst of the storm, like the candle that lights others without losing its flame. So breathe, smile, remember. The pain wasn't your fault, but the healing is your responsibility, and that is your power. If this touched something deep in you, and if you're ready to explore more teachings like this, gently, profoundly, and at your own pace, you're invited to stay on the path with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom for weekly reflections, timeless Buddhist truths, and stories that bring peace to the noise. And if you know someone quietly struggling, share this with them. You never know. A single insight might change their whole world. Until next time, may your steps be light, your heart be clear, and your mind free.